Welcome to TradeTheMBI.com. This is John. This report is for the 2nd of June. Started a new month, and it's always best to look at the past month that we just completed. And so if we go back to the beginning of May and our lovely cyan candles, we started with the first, and we ended up with a negative situation there. But by the time the month was done, we ended up with plus 46 and a quarter day points from our simple trades of the cyan candles moving higher. That wasn't to say that we didn't still agree that we were in long trades going on from that point, but just trading those 46 and a quarter ES points, pretty hard to not be doing well when you're following that kind of information. Followed from the NASDAQ too. Interestingly enough, the NASDAQ still holding on as more bullish than the other markets, though we can see that rising cyan has meant a little bit more downside pressure in that we've seen a lot more selling. Steel moving to the safety zone. So that's an interesting factor. The fact now that you have red above zero, well above all those peaks for the NASDAQ's much more positive market there. The YM had been the weakest of all, and kind of flattening out there. So the potential of a little trouble there. We finally got the steel below cyan. That's your first negative marker, and if it moves again, this could start to look pretty ugly for the YM. So something to point out. Well, you know what I did promise? I would show the. Let me put it up here. The daily. This happens to be, I believe it's the MBI Opus Future Strategy. Well, we can look at what the performance report has going on for it. Still not quite at equity highs, though. I think the current trade that's in, it's up a little bit. It'll get it closer there. Easy way to see what it is. So this was a GAM setup, buying right there. The ATR looking for about 1.23 times the ATR 20 points. So that's about 1929 roughly for a target point on it. It's got a shot at getting there. It's only 8 or so points away. Always need to look at those because that's from a broader perspective, but you combine that with our cyan candles, very interesting setup, and of course the granddaddy of them all. Let me move this now because we've got some new stops here. 1914.50, the 50K chart is just destroying it now that much. See, this was the expansion from the daily MBI Opus, which you can trade from a much broader perspective using monthly options, that kind of thing. And here a little bit more active, but still fairly slow in its response, and it can take days and days for it. Potentially can take us over the 400 marker, which would be well above this point right here, creating a new bracket, and of course it'd be all-time highs from that. And we can look at the year gains. Hasn't really changed much from where we were last at, but I just find it's fun because less than 50% win rate. We already knew from this one we would have taken advantage of the higher peak before the sell, and so you can see the separation like I pointed out. And nothing about that is a change. Finally, we got started to get a little closer, but it broke away because you still couldn't get any steel moving back up above. Sure, there's plenty of positive extremes. Yes, they will get retraced, but got to see a little bit more decay. I'll be interested to see if the red breaks below the 7.5 range here. That would be the start of it, but that's just sideways bullishness. See if the cyan gets a little bit further up. The stop obviously higher, so it just becomes a point of, well, goofing off, just watching it, because there's nothing you can do while it's in a beautiful trend like that. You just let it be, which I know can be boring. We look at some of the intraday stuff, and this is the latest version that I've added. It was fun right here. We were pointing this out. These numbers right here correspond to the pivots of the red at the peak point. So we can see 5.58 was the last one, and then boom, this one shows up 5.53. Lower pivot, higher price. Well, that's a prime short opportunity. And yes, it came down. Then it becomes interesting because we have the up pivots as depicted right here, and then your next down pivot. And then you can just begin to watch where the relationship is and when they break above the previous levels. We first look for our steel crossing above the green, and if you get above your cyan within the 4-bar count there, 1, 2, and 3, comes a buy opportunity there. And in fact, turned out to be a decent one. Nothing special. I mean, this is a pretty narrow range, which is what we're getting from what we're seeing on the daily. But um, all in all, pretty fine. No objections to any of it. We look at TLT here from a broader range. Still looks pretty decent, even though we've been kind of holding flat. We had a couple of positive extremes that had to be retraced. Still a bit overbought there, even showing yellow on that. So not looking for a whole lot of activity, but still rising red. It's got to get above, that's 8.02, where the peak is. I don't have it activated on this chart for, that's the Bicel C program that I showed with the added inputs. Oh, and I should show that from an input standpoint, actually I need to do it from the actual Bicel C program. There we go. Just go to format and you push inputs and you can turn them false, and that will remove the lines. So you can get rid of the dark red ones, which just give you the variable change in the directional degree ratio of angle for the decline, and or you can turn off any of these pivot numbers. I think they're just convenient because then you can kind of just visually see, am I getting a higher pivot? Well, clearly that's a higher pivot when you compare those, lower pivots from the upside ones you can look at, or whether they're higher than a previous one. And I like to look at the major ones. This was a clear indication that you had much higher pivots. You were expecting higher until you got to the other resistance, which was going to be the previous pivot, and it still produced higher. So this would become an attractive buy setup going forward here. We would just need to look for the beginning of a green pivot. Hasn't even gone to red. So little things like that. That's going to be expanding into additional ones. And what will be nice about it is because then in the strategy formats, we'll be able to compare those pivot values to add to whether or not a function is proper, best, or less likely to perform. And so it's going to be even more accurate than trying to utilize the zones and setting up conditions within each of the zones. USO, nothing special there. Gold, some people were asking, was it time to get into? No, it's still ugly. There's nothing you can do with that. You just have to wait for it to finish its maneuver. I would expect it's even going to start into a dark red setup here, so even a turnaround isn't going to survive very much. And this is a factor of what they were showing about GDP numbers, ugly. Manufacturing obviously not going to be in good shape, which is bad news for X, which is an indication of potentially where economic conditions are going to go. I know they're all talking about a great second quarter, blah, 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 but if that were the case, you'd be seeing it in a lot of these because then all these materials and things would be wanting to move higher. And at this particular point, they are not looking delicious. They are looking like, no, we got a problem. Houston, there's trouble on the horizon. Is the Fed going to have to spend another $5-6 trillion adding to their balance sheet and buying mortgage-backed securities to keep the market up? Potentially. I don't know at what point does 20 trillion in debt, is that too much? Does that cause, additional impact? These are going to be some interesting questions. Is it time yet? No. But people will start talking about it, and will begin to start weighing on things. But there's no alternative for your money at this particular point. JCP is an interesting one that it gave a little teeny buy, but see it's already rolling over, separated on there. Oops, went too far. Let me plop up the alert stocks. I know I spent a little time there going over some of that stuff. Bullishness with Apple does not change. Amazon weakness does not change. It's interesting to see the dichotomy between some of these charts and what's going on, and then the ones that have reached kind of a mixed battle point. Google potentially looks like it's going to get a little bit weaker right here. Just had to retrace this positive extreme though, so I mean it's not like this is the end of the day, but it did exactly that. Pretty straightforward stuff. Netflix we liked, continue to do what it's doing. Such easy diagramming on these. Got into the extreme up there with the steel. Started to make its move, took out the lower peak. That's usually the beginning of a little bit of a retrace. You got some positive extremes going all the way back to here for PCLN. So all that high flying could look ugly for some. We'll be like, what happened? Nothing special happened, just what we expected to. This got a little bit weaker here as you were breaking up. I know we were talking about it, and it takes a couple of days sometimes. Still form new high, ends up closing on the lows. Not a shock with that. Um, would need to break down further. You would need to see this green take out that bottom low. Hasn't happened yet, so it's just a modest kind of pullback. Twitter, we laughed at everyone who said the bottom was in. We had our little decent pop as it began to roll up. Not a big deal. It was in deep red, so we knew it was an opportunity to look intraday at any short opportunity for a return back, and it did exactly what was expected of it. I know that gets people angry because they're like, oh, but it's so wonderful. I don't care what the company does. It's irrelevant to what we're seeing the money do because everything else is just talk. And while I do plenty of talking, it still comes down to what we see on the readings. And if they're not copacetic for a higher price, then you got a problem. That's not going to be good for FAS either. You said continue rising and start to flatten out. Steel dipping below both cyan and the green, and also dip below the red. Dip of the green, and you're going to be looking at quite a bit more of a retrace. And Facebook saw a modest pull, but then there it is, your DOC spread. First beginning picture of it there, and that's what the magenta candle reflects. Drop below with the steel below the cyan. Cyan breaks above the green. Green dips below red. The only thing you don't have yet would be red below white, and that's when you'll see the big down bar. So take your gains, be happy, and enjoy it. And a quick roll through of the numbers. Here's some of the high flyers. Kind of a mixed bag looking at that. See how the Dow is faring. Not too horrible for the Dow. Overall S&P. And the NASDAQ. Interesting, a lot more red in the NASDAQ than considering it's doing better than the other indexes. So that may mean it's particular to just a few items. And there you have that. Quick and easy. So what a fun start to the month. We will continue to look at some of the setups, and it's going to be fun because when I do some of the adjustments on the Opus Net, we're going to have additional little color ones that we'll be able to take advantage of for both day plays like we have with the cyan candles, and we'll be able to create some additional ones, and I'll be starting to give you those as they pop in where we have specific ideas of unique moves, and that way you'll be able to, maybe even make some in between swing trades as well as day trades as we go along in the month, and that will get you a little more active with some of them. And then particularly, even if I see some of the alert ones as being special, I know we go over them generally where they're at, but there are certain configurations that would be more attractive than others, and we'll point them out so that we'll be able to take advantage of them. As always, look for me on the private Twitter feed, Stock Twits, and indicators for the new month will already be out by now. So if you haven't got them, please check your emails. As always, trade well.